think this book is really a case of a book that was made beautifully at the wrong time. So today we're going to be talking about The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, and I wanted to do this for a couple reasons. One, I've always wanted to cover a literary classic on the channel, and even though it was scandalized at the time of its release, it is widely considered a literary classic today. And two, because today's Halloween, and this is billed as a psychological thriller. At least I believe that that's what Oscar Wilde had intended, and there are certainly elements of that. Although I wouldn't say we get into the psychological thriller stuff proper until about the last half of the book. I would say a majority of this book is based on philosophy and the nature of existence. We are in 19th century England, and our three key players are obviously the titular Dorian Gray, who is described as having ethereal good looks. He's a young man of about 20. And also we have two members of, I would say, the gentlemanly class, noble class, Lord Henry Wotton and Basil Hallward. The plot itself, if we were to strip it down to its barest bones, an absolute minimum of bullet points, is actually rather basic. Where this story really shines is the interaction of the characters, some of the subtext, and really the beautiful writing, because if I had a nickel for every time I said, I wish I wrote that line, I'd be very rich. To put it plainly, Basil Hallward is commissioned to do a portrait of Dorian Gray, and once the portrait is finished, Dorian finds himself madly in love with the portrait and wishes that it would grow old instead of him, so that way he could stay as beautiful as this painting forever. Essentially, that prayer is answered, and as Dorian gets older and kind of finds his way into vice and sin, the portrait itself grows older and comes to reflect those sins, whereas he keeps his youth, but finds himself on a really troubled path. Now, I mentioned at the top of the video that this book was highly scandalized and criticized when it was first released. Keep in mind this was 1890, 1891, for its depiction not only of harm to others and use of illegal substances, but most importantly for that time and our time as well, the depiction or suggestion of homosexual relationships between Dorian and his friends, between Dorian and Basil, but also between Dorian and Henry Wotton as well. In fact, The Picture of Dorian Gray was actually originally published in the July issue of Lippincott Monthly magazine in 1890, and its publication received so much backlash that when it was released in book form the next year, Wilde took it upon himself to heavily censor certain passages and reword them to obscure some of the more overt references to gay relationships. And in the introduction and notes section of this book, they do have the unedited passages. But as the introduction says, yes, it may have done the book some harm in our reading of it today to have it edited the way it was. But also, so much was added in this new edition of Wilde's. He fleshed out a lot of the characters, so it's hard to say, that we lost a great deal in this new translation when so much was added. Also, too, what I am glad about, when I heard this book was censored, and the mere fact that it came out in the 1890s, not an era known for sexual freedom, I'd say, I thought that it was going to be really hard to read the LGBT subtext, the gay subtext of this book, and that you'd have to really go digging. You don't really have to. I mean, in the opening pages of this book, Basil Hallward, the painter, and Lord Henry Wotton, or Harry as Basil calls him, are talking, and Basil's saying, in the time he's gotten to know Dorian as a subject, how enthralled he's become with him, how essential to his art he's become, and how he feels the portrait itself isn't good because he put too much of his worship of Dorian into it, and his feelings for Dorian into it. So you don't have to read too deeply to understand the relationship between specifically those two characters. And in time, you get to see the relationship between Harry and Dorian as well. I think one way to understand this text and its themes, one theme you could put into it is the different types of love, pure love versus possessing love. The way the way Basil Hallward talks about Dorian. Here we have Basil talking to Harry shortly before Harry meets Dorian about how Basil is in love with Dorian's simple nature, his beautiful nature, and how he would not seek to change it. How Dorian, as he is, has influenced so much in him. And as Harry meets Dorian, he finds a similar fascination in Dorian, but where he takes it is so much different. He develops a desire to possess Dorian. At certain points, he takes great pleasure in manipulating him like a violin. He's able to enthrall Dorian with his theories on life that eventually lead him down a dark path. In a lot of ways, it kind of feels like our modern interpretation of what healthy love, gay love, straight love, whatever type of love should be, versus how many people viewed gay love in the past, and even how it was used in commercial rhetoric as a way of manipulating young boys.
Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual, a person who demands an intimate relationship with members of their own sex. But by now, Jimmy felt a fondness for Ralph, and they continued to go places together. Ralph was generous and took Jimmy many interesting places and did many nice things for him. He bought presents and even gave him money, but payments were expected in return.
Harry essentially views Dorian as a wonderful science project, as a beautiful test subject for ways he can exercise his will upon him. He wants to possess that beauty and mold it to his own will, essentially. So back to Harry's views for a moment. One of the things that so captures Dorian is Harry's views on life. He believes that we should be ushering in a new era of hedonism, where we are service to our pleasures and passions, and when we do what we want and act on our impulses, that relieves us from stress and anxiety, essentially. And Dorian, being only a young man, I think about 20 at this point in the book, is enthralled by that because he is also, obviously searching for what meaning should be, and he finds these theories fascinating. The chief reason that Basil does not want Harry hanging out with Dorian is because he knows that for gentlemen of their station, Dorian getting to believe all these things is a dangerous path for him, and could lead him to disgrace and ruin. And here we get into what is possibly the biggest and most well fleshed out theme in the book, this idea of having a double life, this idea of hypocrisy, because Harry's defense is that gentlemen of their stature behave this way in private, but are different public facing, and they are nothing more than hypocrites. And therefore, why shouldn't Dorian exercise, will upon his passions and whatnot? This idea is probably most concretely communicated in the portrait itself. So as I said earlier in my extremely brief plot summary, Dorian sees the portrait completed by Basil and says that he wishes the portrait would get older while he stayed the same as the appearance and beauty in the portrait. So that essentially amounted to a deal with the devil, where the essence of Dorian's soul, not his entire soul, he still lives in his body, but the essence of his soul is now trapped in the portrait and will age and will see the effects of his sin, while he gets to stay young and beautiful and give the appearance of purity. Or, getting to maintain the appearance of a gentleman while also pursuing his passions. Under Harry's guidance, and in doing things that only please his immediate senses, he finds himself not only addicted to drugs, but also leading his friends down paths of harm. He harms them mentally and emotionally and physically, leading a lot of them to their own financial ruin and opening the gates to temptation as well. And this eventually earns him a reputation to not be associated with by many people, and his reputation does end up somewhat tarnished as well. And you can really see how he can be influenced by Harry, because the way the way Lord Wotton is described in the book, it seems like he could spin any tale and anyone could believe it. And only through the benefit of age, I guess, through the benefit of years, could you recognize these theories as dangerous, as many of Dorian's contemporaries do, but at the time he was so young, what was he to think of it? On page 42, the narrator says of Harry's rhetoric, "The praise of folly," as he went on, "soared into a philosophy, and philosophy herself became young, and catching the mad music of pleasure, wearing, one might fancy, her wine-stained robe and wreath of ivy, danced like a Bacchante over the hills of life, and mocked the slow Silenus for being sober. Facts fled before her like frightened forest things. Her white feet trod the huge press at which wise Omar sits, till the seething grape juice rose round her bare lips in waves of purple bubbles, or crawled in red foam over the vat's black, dripping, slopping sides." It was an extraordinary improvisation. He felt the eyes of Dorian Gray were fixed on him, and the consciousness that among his audience there was one whose temperament he wished to fascinate seemed to give his wit keenness and lend color to his imagination. He was brilliant, fantastic, irresponsible. He charmed his listeners out of themselves, and they followed his pipe laughing. Dorian Gray never took his gaze off him, but sat like one under a spell, smiles chasing each other over his lips, and wonder growing grave in his darkening eyes. First of all, let's take a moment to appreciate how beautiful that passage was. It's probably my favorite in the book, with its imagery and its comparison of words to beautiful nature scenes. There's a lot of that in this book. But also, it's a great example of how gifted of a speaker Harry is, and how he's able to understand the things that Dorian wants to hear and capture his attention and keep it and his audience for as long as he likes. Really, he has them eating out of the palm of his hand. Facts be damned, essentially. It's interesting too, and speaks to a different aspect of the hypocrisy that Basil points out frequently, is that even though Harry espouses these values, he rarely sees them act on it, which is kind of the inverse of what we see with Dorian. Dorian, in his public-facing life, maintains the appearance of a gentleman, but acts on his pleasures, whereas Henry espouses the values of pleasures, but it appears in his private life acts like a gentleman. And knowing how Harry behaves does add an extra level of sinisterness to his actions toward Dorian, especially when he himself truly in his own life doesn't endorse the pursuit of pleasure in the same way that he advocates for. As we get further on into the book, we notice that Dorian's relationship with all of his friends begins to change, and most interestingly probably is his relationship with the portrait. At first, when he notices the first change in the portrait after a major life event happens, he's very frightened by it and rarely visits it. And then, as a little bit more time goes on, he begins to take pleasure in seeing all the changes that are being done to his soul, and wonders how far he can push the envelope. It's almost like he's maintaining a lot of his, more boyish impulses as he stays, in this youthful frame. But then, as we near the climax and end of the book, essentially, we see Dorian begin to fear for his soul and begin to wonder, what has life come to? When his own life is threatened, he wonders, what has life come to? Have I really led a fulfilling life? And he begins the desire to change, to become a better person and improve his soul. Soon, this fascination begets paranoia, and he worries that people in his life will learn his secret and about the corruption of his soul. So even though he's led a life of travel and leisure in pursuit of his pleasures, eventually he becomes very paranoid and refuses to leave the portrait for long stretches of time. When his own life comes into danger toward the climax and ending of the book, he begins to question what has his life really come to, and begins to hate his relationship with the portrait. The question then becomes, and this was probably one of the more disturbing elements of the book for me, minus the actual depicted acts of violence, is can he be redeemed? Because as Harry points out, he says, I don't think you want to be redeemed, I think you're just searching for a new sensation. And here we go back to the value on sensation, the pedestal that sensation is being put on. And it's like, how does Dorian know his own mind? How does he know if he really wants to change or if he's just getting bored? And that question to ponder was definitely one that made you spiral a little bit. Spoilers for the last couple chapters of this book, so if you don't want to hear about that, you can skip to this time code. But what ends up happening, essentially, is Dorian commits what he believes to be one of his first good acts in refusing to run away with this young girl and essentially spoil her innocence for his own pleasure and eventually dump her, he decides to cut the relationship off there and disabuse her of any of his, more foul intentions. And he believes that this will cause great change to the portrait, and he learns that it hasn't, that in fact his portrait has gotten more deformed, more scowling. There's blood on his portrait from a previous incident that I'm not quite sure I want to spoil, but from all the harm he's done, and he sees even more blood. And he, becomes frantic, and he begins to think, the only way I can be free of this is if I end the portrait, is if I cut the portrait and slice it, and it's no more than my soul will be free. He stabs the portrait, and in stabbing the portrait, he's killing his own soul, so he himself dies and becomes the image that was in the portrait of this very corrupted older man who wears his sins on his face, and is a far cry from the beauty he once was. In relation to that ending, I want to discuss kind of the criticism that this book faced very generally in its own time, and how audiences of the time didn't think the moral was properly carried through, were confused about what the moral actually was. And to that, I want to provide somewhat of an answer. In his note before the beginning of the book, in his preface before the beginning of the book, Wilde says that how we interpret art, how we see art, says more about the spectator than the artist, and that good art hides the artist's intentions. So I don't know, knowing what Oscar Wilde wanted to do with this book, if it's valid to say, that his moral wasn't clear, because I think that's up to the reader, and I think especially in today's day and age where we discuss death of the author, and what that essentially means is what the author's original intention was doesn't really matter, because it's once you consume the art piece, it's yours to interpret. When we consider it in that light, it's kind of like we take away from it what we will, right? I say all that to say also, we can't ignore the fact that Wilde's life mirrored Dorian's pretty closely. Some of you may know that Wilde was arrested and convicted of committing homosexual acts with one of his friends after that friend's father essentially blackmailed Wilde and was the leading charge in his conviction. And we kind of see this through Dorian's own life, the way that he's accused of dragging promising men down toward ruin and sacrificing their reputations. So even though I think Wilde said what he said to kind of protect his own freedom and his own expression, we can't ignore the obvious parallels here at the same time. A common criticism too was that the wit and humor got in the way of the messaging and made it, less clear. I think this book is really a case of a book that was made beautifully at the wrong time, because I think Wilde would have been understood a lot more in our own time than he probably was in his own time. I think the humor was a wonderful compliment to the book, and I stand by what I said earlier. Personally, I think there's a lot of moral questions to this book, and I think it's good to sit with those questions. And I think the humor, wit, sarcasm, cynicism only amplifies the idea that you should really, analyze your own belief systems in relation to this text. If you like this video, please leave a like and comment letting me know down below. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new videos from me. Special thanks to my patrons for helping to make this video possible. It was definitely a journey. You'll see their names at the end here. And I don't know what book we're going to be reading next, but I know in the future we're going to be reading the second book of the Daughter of the Moon Goddess Celestial Kingdom series, so I'm excited for that. That's coming in the mail in about 2 weeks. But you can leave your suggestions for what to read next, topics you'd like me to cover next in the comments down below as well. And yeah, happy Halloween, guys. Thanks for sticking around.